Okay, so we're going to really briefly go over the states' rights information that we learned last week. I just want to make sure you guys got exactly what you needed to get from last week. So we're going to look at states' rights, and the big question for states' rights is basically who should have more power? Should the U.S. have more power, or should the states have more power to make decisions? So we're going to look at three major questions. This is what you looked at last week. Who should be able to make decisions about slavery? Should it be the U.S. or should it be each individual state? Number two, should slavery be allowed to expand west into those new territories and new states? And number three, which states can secede or leave from the USA? So can they leave? Is it allowed? Is it legal? Is it a good idea? So we're going to look at those three questions. We're going to answer those. Okay, so in order to understand this idea, what I want you guys to get is that this is all about federalism, okay? So this idea here of federalism that we've studied before becomes super important here in this argument about whether the state can make decisions or the federal government can make decisions. So remember, federalism means that the U.S. government makes some decisions for us, and then the state government also makes some decisions for us. And sometimes they have to share those decisions. So, for example, the USA gets to decide how old you are to drink in the United States. We, as a state, as Texas, don't get to change that age. But the USA can't tell Texas how old people have to be to drive because Texas makes that decision for ourselves. But then both Texas and the USA tax us as citizens of Texas and the United States. So this is the idea of federalism. There's some things that they both do to us, like taxes, and there's some things that the US does, and then there's some things that the state does. Now, we've gotten pretty good in the last 100 years at figuring out who should do what, but in 1860, they were trying to figure out who was going to get to have the power to do certain things. So we're going to look at this here and understand this idea of states' rights. So we want to look at what the southern states believed first. So we're going to look at the southern states. So the southern states believed that the states had the right to reject federal laws if they didn't agree with them or if they thought they were unfair. So that means that the southern states believed that the states had the right to make decisions about slavery. This was a huge thing for the South. They did not want the U.S. government to make decisions about slavery because they mostly thought that the U.S. government would make the wrong decision about slavery. And the southern states believed that slaves or enslaved people could be taken into Western territories or even into the North and still be considered slaves because they're property, not people. So this was the major thing that the southern states believed. And then last but not least on this slide, it becomes important to understand this. The southern states believed that they had the right to secede if they wanted to. They said, if we choose to leave the USA, there is nothing that can stop us. And this becomes super important because this is really what leads us into the Civil War right here. This idea of secession, or can I secede or leave? Now, remember, if the South likes something, that automatically means the North doesn't like it. So if you look at states' rights from a Northern point of view, then the Northern states believe that the federal government, the USA, should have more power than the state governments. Okay, so they thought that the Constitution should be the most important. They should basically be number one. Okay, and that the states should have to listen to the Constitution. On the other hand, the southern states were like, the states themselves should have the power and should tell the federal government what to do. Now, so this was the big problem because the idea of who should have the most power was broken up between the northern states and the southern states. In general, the northern states said it should be the USA with most power, and the southern states said that nope, we individual states should have the most power. Now, the problem with this is that neither of them were really right, but there was no way for them to figure out who, like a good compromise or anything, until this court case, the Dred Scott case, came to the Supreme Court. Now, this becomes important because what happens in Dred Scott really impacts these ideas about who has more power. So we want to look at briefly the Dred Scott case. Now, don't forget, Dred Scott was a slave. He was born in a slave state. He lived there for a long time, and then his owner took him to a free state. While he was in that free state, he lived there with his owner, and then he got married. He had a couple of kids, and then his owner took him back to a slave state. Now, the idea back then was if you're a slave and you make it to a free state, then you can declare yourself free. You can become free. So Dred Scott, when he gets back into the southern states where slavery, everybody believes in slavery, he sues his owner to be free. He actually had tried to buy his freedom a few times, and they wouldn't allow him to. So he sued, went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court made three major decisions from the Dred Scott case. First, they said, Dred, you are not a citizen. You are not a United States citizen, so technically you cannot sue in court, and you definitely can't sue a United States citizen, which your owner is a U.S. citizen, but you're not. So that was the first thing. The second thing they said was, you're a slave, and slaves are property, not people. So that is a big deal here because they were basically agreeing with the South. Okay, so the Supreme Court said that the South was right, that slaves were property, not people. So that basically the South was right in how they were treating them. And then the third thing that happened in this decision is that the Supreme Court, and this guy here is Roger Taney, who is the head of Supreme Court justice at the time. And he said that the idea of slavery and whether it should be allowed in the United States and other places is actually illegal because the US government can't make decisions, can't make compromises like the Missouri Compromise and the Compromise of 1850, which, don't forget, had already happened years ago because the US was trying to figure out what to do with those new territories. And he said, they're illegal, those compromises. That the US government can't make decisions about slavery and shouldn't be making decisions about slavery because it's not their place, that each individual state should make their own decisions about slavery, and that slavery should be allowed in every state of the USA. You don't have to own slaves, you don't have to practice slavery, but it can't be outlawed. Now, this was a big problem because since slavery then becomes basically allowable everywhere, it means that the Supreme Court was basically taking the South side and saying that the South was right. They could have slavery and no one should stop them. And so the North was very unhappy with this decision. Of course, the South was very happy with the decision. And the South felt like this decision by the Supreme Court really helped their argument that each individual state should have more power than the US government. So this leads us even more into what is coming immediately after this, which is the Civil War, because the North and the South are getting farther and farther apart. Instead of coming together and making these compromises and coming up with ways to work with each other, this decision actually pushes them farther and farther apart, so much so that they are willing to start fighting with each other, which will lead us into the Civil War.